The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword has a bad reputation among Zelda games. When it first released in 2011 for the Nintendo Wii, it was met with a very mixed reception from fans of the Zelda series. While the game certainly had its supporters, there were many who criticized various aspects of the game's design, most notably the game's extensive use of motion controls. You see, Skyward Sword had its entire game built and designed around motion controls. You had to swing the Wii remote in order to swing your sword, tilt and aim it at the screen to use the various equipment you picked up, and angle it properly in order to take down certain enemies that would block you. The game's puzzles, dungeons, and combat encounters were all designed around making full use of these controls. This was all meant to make the experience more immersive and engaging, but it only served to frustrate a large portion of the player base in the end, myself included. When I first played Skyward Sword all those years ago, I was extremely torn because I'm such a huge Legend of Zelda fan, but I was not a fan of the game's motion controls. I found swinging the sword, which is one of the main things you do in every Zelda game, to be completely unreliable. Aiming equipment like the bow and the beetle was also a pain because you had to constantly recenter the Wii remote after it would lose its position on the screen. These issues persisted throughout my playthroughs of the game, which led to a frustrating gameplay experience. And motion controls were not the game's only problems. Skyward Sword was also plagued by numerous questionable design choices, including constant gameplay interruptions, unskippable dialogue, and several unnecessary gameplay sections, to name a few. It was unusual to see a Zelda game suffer from so many issues, and they unfortunately took away from an otherwise enjoyable game. Skyward Sword's story, characters, and overall world were charming and enjoyable to experience. Dungeons and puzzles were very well designed and wouldn't have been out of place in any of the 3D Zelda games that came before it. And even though the combat had its problems, there were still several enjoyable combat encounters that were pretty fun to play through. While it did become my least favorite 3D Zelda title, Skyward Sword did end up feeling to me like a proper Zelda game despite its issues, but I found myself in the small minority of people who felt that way back in 2011. The game's bad reputation kept many people from either finishing the game or from playing it altogether, and its sales suffered as a result. Fast forward to a couple months ago, when a remaster of the game called Skyward Sword HD was released. Meant to celebrate both the 35th anniversary of the Zelda franchise and the 10th anniversary of the game, Skyward Sword HD was a chance for Nintendo to give this beleaguered game another chance. This remaster sought to fix or improve many of the problems that plagued the original version in order to provide a more streamlined way to play the game. In addition to better graphics and a better frame rate, Skyward Sword HD reduced the amount of gameplay interruptions, added a free camera to more easily look around, and added a button-only control scheme to give players another way to play the game, among a few other things. When I played through this new version a few weeks ago, I was pleasantly surprised by how much I felt the game had improved. My biggest issues with the game were the motion controls and the constant pauses for item descriptions and for your companion fee, and this remaster either mitigated or completely removed those problems, which allowed the best parts of the game to really shine. While it still remains my least favorite 3D Zelda title, its standing has improved significantly in my eyes because of the changes that were made. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case for a lot of people. While I've seen many people praise this remaster across the internet, I've seen just as many people continuing to criticize and put down Skyward Sword. Even with the changes that were made, there are those that still see Skyward Sword as a terrible game, a mistake that pales in comparison to both its predecessors and to Breath of the Wild. While I do agree that each of those games is better than Skyward Sword, that doesn't mean Skyward Sword is a bad game. It has just about everything you could want out of a Zelda title, and to be honest, I think it deserves more respect. The game still has some issues that I'll talk more about later, but overall, Skyward Sword HD is a game that is well worth your time, whether you played the original game on the Wii or whether you've never played Skyward Sword before. First, I want to talk about the changes that were made to the original game and why I think they make this remaster the superior version. Then I'll talk about the best parts of Skyward Sword that make this game worthwhile, as well as some of the issues that still remain. Like I said earlier, one of my biggest issues with Skyward Sword was its extensive use of motion controls. I found the Wii remote to be frequently unreliable in accurately following my movements, whether I was swinging a sword or using a piece of equipment. In Skyward Sword HD, this issue was significantly reduced to the point where it became a minor annoyance rather than a full-on problem. During my playthrough, I found the Joy-Cons to be much more accurate and responsive than the Wii remote, which meant I didn't end up as frustrated with the gameplay as I used to. I still had trouble sometimes where I couldn't get the Joy-Cons to do what I wanted, but the number of times this happened was significantly less than in the original game. Additionally, I believe the better frame rate of this HD version provided for a smoother gameplay experience, which ultimately helped the motion controls perform even better as a result. When you combine that with the fact that you could recenter the Joy-Cons at the simple push of a button, you have a motion-controlled gameplay experience that was way better than what the original game had. If you don't want to use the motion controls, this remaster also gives players the option to use a button-only control scheme, where the right thumbstick is used to control your sword. The sword will move in whatever direction you move the thumbstick, allowing you to remove motion from the game entirely and provide a slightly more traditional Zelda experience. I messed around with this control scheme a little bit and found that it works pretty well. I ultimately ended up sticking with motion controls because of its improvements and because I was used to using them for this game, but from what I've heard, there are many people that have changed their opinions about Skyward Sword because of these new controls alone. My other biggest issue with the original game had to do with the constant interruptions for picking up items and for your companion Fi. Like previous 3D Zelda titles, Skyward Sword pairs you with a companion character that helps guide you throughout your adventure. In this game, that companion was the spirit of the Master Sword known as Fi, a sort of robotic entity that was created by the goddess Hylia to guide Link throughout his journey. During your adventure, she would occasionally pop up on her own to provide important information about your current quest and objectives, and she could also be called on if you got stuck at any point in the game. While that all sounds normal for a Zelda game, the amount of times she would pop up unannounced was kind of ridiculous. Aside from simply ruining the flow of the game, these interruptions felt like Nintendo was trying to hold your hand during the entire playthrough. Before you even had a chance to think through a problem yourself, the game would automatically provide you with either a hint or the answer almost immediately, which was very frustrating as someone who enjoys thinking through a problem. To make matters worse, the original Skyward Sword had even more interruptions in the form of item descriptions. During your adventure, you'll come across various items that can be used to improve your equipment. When you would pick these items up in the original game, you'd be forced to sit through this animation where Link holds up the item, then stores it in his inventory. Every single time. It didn't matter if you found the same item 2 minutes ago, you had to watch the animation every time. This was one of the most baffling design decisions I'd ever seen in a video game, and combined with the interruptions from Fi, it had a big negative impact on my gameplay experience. Thankfully, this HD remaster either severely mitigates or completely removes these interruptions, which by itself improves the game dramatically. Now when you pick up items, you only have to watch that animation the first time you find an item. Every time after that, it just gets placed in your inventory automatically. In terms of Fi, she still pops up unexpectedly to explain things, but it happens much less frequently than before. This not only helps the flow of the game, it also gives you a chance to figure things out for yourself. She still provides assistance if you need it, but now that assistance is optional, which is a very welcome change. Between limiting these interruptions, improving the motion controls, and adding a button-only control scheme, Skyward Sword HD fixed or reduced most of the technical problems that I had with the game, which is why I hold this remaster in such a high regard. The other quality of life improvements were simply icing on the cake for me. Being able to quickly skip through dialogue now was very helpful for certain conversations, though I do usually tend to read most of the dialogue in a game by default. Having additional save slots is another cool feature that gives you more options when loading up your playthrough, and the addition of the free camera was really great because it made the overall gameplay even smoother. While some of these features probably should have been in the original game by default, the fact of the matter is they're here now, and they make Skyward Sword better as a result. Now that the amount of frustrations and annoyances has been reduced in this game, it allows players to really focus on the actual game itself, which in turn allows the best parts of Skyward Sword to really shine. Like I said earlier in this video, one of the things Skyward Sword does really well is puzzles and dungeons. There's a lot of really cool and interesting equipment you'll find during your adventure, and the game makes great use of them both in dungeons and throughout the world. For example, the Beetle is essentially a drone that you can control by guiding it with the Joy-Con. You use it to find hidden switches, cut ropes, or deliver bombs to specific areas, to name a few uses. It's one of the earliest items you'll acquire, but you'll end up using it a lot throughout the entire game, which is another one of this game's best features. You'll find that Skyward Sword has you using almost all of your equipment for most of the game, instead of having them become virtually obsolete after finishing their corresponding dungeon. This makes later challenges more rewarding because you have to make use of everything you've learned and gained up to that point. Additionally, many of the puzzles and dungeons involve some really interesting gameplay mechanics. Like many people, one of my favorite mechanics in this game is the time shift stones that you find in the desert. By striking these stones, you can essentially turn back time within a certain area, which affects both the environment and enemies. It's such a cool idea for a mechanic, and Skyward Sword makes great use of it throughout the game. While not every dungeon involves something so cool, most of them usually have some sort of interesting mechanic or defining feature. Now, some people say that Skyward Sword has some of the best dungeons in the Zelda series. While I personally don't agree with that, the dungeons in this game are very well designed and are easily highlights of the game. Another thing Skyward Sword does well is the charm that it brings to its story, characters, and world. The town of Skyloft is quaint and comfy, making it a nice place to return to after finishing a dungeon. Its residents have a lot of personality and provide some interesting conversations and side quests throughout your adventure. And the music and overall art style of the game create a very friendly and relaxing atmosphere, whether you're exploring Skyloft or one of the game's 3 main areas. As for the story itself, I've always found it to be very interesting as a fan of the Zelda series. Skyward Sword essentially tells the origin story of the entire Zelda timeline, including the origins of the Master Sword, Ganondorf, and the Kingdom of Hyrule. We also get to learn more about the Triforce and the goddess Hylia, and their connection to Princess Zelda. Along the way, we meet a lot of interesting and entertaining characters, including the flamboyant villain Girahim and everyone's favorite character, Groose. Those two were definitely some of my favorite parts of Skyward Sword and deserve all the love and attention that they get shown by fans of this game. As a big story and lore person, I really enjoyed experiencing this story and relating it to the rest of the Zelda timeline. There's a lot of interesting facts that get introduced in this game that get even more interesting when you factor in the most recent Zelda game, Breath of the Wild. Experiencing it for the 3rd time now did not reduce my enjoyment of it whatsoever. It's as good as it was 10 years ago, and it remains one of the best parts of Skyward Sword. So between the dungeons, puzzles, characters, and story, there's a lot to love about Skyward Sword. When you factor in the quality of life improvements that we discussed, this remaster becomes a game that is absolutely worth your time, even with the issues that still remain. Many of the bosses in this game are among my least favorite Zelda bosses in the entire series. While there are a couple exceptions to this, most of the bosses are either uninteresting or annoying to fight, especially the Imprisoned, who you have to fight 3 separate times. I find flying around in the sky on your loft wing to be boring, uninteresting, and pretty much a waste of time. There's almost nothing of interest in the sky other than the town of Skyloft, which by the way is the only town in the entire game, something I also have an issue with. There's barely anything to do while flying around, and constantly swinging the Joy-Con in order to fly is a pain that detracts from the overall experience. In terms of the motion and new button controls, while they are significant improvements over the controls from the original game, I still don't like that the entire game is designed around motion controls. Combat specifically can still get annoying at times when you have to swing your sword in the right direction or risk getting blocked or worse. I much prefer the regular button controls and gameplay design that every other Zelda game has. And finally, there were a lot of unnecessary gameplay sections throughout Skyward Sword. I'm not going to list them all here, but suffice to say there were several sections throughout the game that just felt like unnecessary fluff. But I want to be clear that those issues I just mentioned do not ruin Skyward Sword. The game's best qualities always outweighed its bad qualities for me, and now that this remaster has significantly improved the game with the quality of life changes we discussed, they outshine the bad parts even more. Look, I understand that not everyone is going to like this game. Even though I've been praising this game all video, it still remains my least favorite 3D Zelda title for good reason. But I don't think Skyward Sword deserves the bad reputation that has continued to follow it after all these years, and it's my hope that people's perceptions of it will one day change for the better. So if you haven't played Skyward Sword before and you like the other 3D Zelda games, I really think you should consider giving this game a shot. If you did play the original Skyward Sword and are wondering if it's really worth it to play this remaster, I truly do believe that it's worth another playthrough. Take it from someone who had significant problems with the game during my first playthrough all those years ago. Skyward Sword HD is a worthy remaster that makes this Zelda game truly shine.